My daughter-in-law closed my bedroom door and said it made more sense this way. I nodded. It was my house. I stood there with my hand still on the doorframe, feeling the warmth of the wood where my palm had rested for decades, and I let my hand fall because there was nothing left to hold. She didn't wait for a response. She walked down the hallway with light steps, confident ones, the kind you have when you believe the ground belongs to you. The door stayed closed. I listened to the click of the latch as if it were a sound that needed memorizing. In that moment, I understood that something had ended, though no one had announced it. I carried my pillow down the hall slowly, not because it was heavy, but because I didn't want to arrive anywhere too soon. The small room at the back of the house looked unchanged, like it had been preserved for someone who never came back. A narrow bed, a dresser with one loose handle, a window that faced the fence instead of the garden. I placed the pillow down carefully, smoothing the case with my hands the way I used to do when my son was small and afraid of the dark. I noticed my hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected shaking. Instead, there was a calmness that felt borrowed, like it wouldn't last if I examined it too closely. The house sounded different after that. Every footstep upstairs reminded me that life was continuing without adjusting its pace for me. The kettle whistled later than usual because I waited until I was sure no one else needed the kitchen. I poured my tea into the cup with the chipped rim because the newer ones had been moved to a higher shelf. I drank standing up, watching steam rise and disappear, thinking about how quickly things can change without changing at all. No one had shouted, no one had accused. The quietness made it harder to argue with what had happened. When my son finally spoke to me that evening, he did it from the doorway, his body angled away as if he might leave mid-sentence. He said it was temporary. He said marriages need boundaries. He said it was easier this way. I listened without interrupting because I wanted him to finish before I realized he had already finished choosing. His voice sounded careful, rehearsed, like he had practiced saying these words somewhere else. I nodded again because nodding had become a useful skill. He smiled with relief, mistaking my silence for agreement, and left before I could say something that would have made it real. I lay awake that night listening to the unfamiliar sounds of intimacy above me, muffled laughter, the scrape of furniture being rearranged. I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the nights I had lain awake in that house before, worrying about money, about sickness, about my son coming home late. Those worries had belonged to me. This one felt different. This one felt like I was being slowly erased from a story I was still standing inside. I pressed my palm flat against my chest and waited for the heaviness to pass. It didn't. It simply settled, like dust. In the morning, I folded my clothes into the dresser, discovering that the bottom drawer stuck unless you lifted it slightly. I made a note of that in my head, though I didn't know why. I have always noticed small things. It was how I kept the world orderly when larger things felt unmanageable. I noticed how the sunlight didn't reach this room until late afternoon. I noticed how the walls were thinner, how voices traveled more clearly here. I noticed how easily I adapted to being smaller. Days passed like this, quietly, without announcement. Meals were eaten at different times. Conversations happened in rooms I was no longer comfortable entering. My daughter-in-law rearranged the living room furniture so the chair I favored was no longer facing the window. She asked me once, politely, if I minded. I said no before she finished the sentence. Saying no had started to feel like an unnecessary risk. I watched her settle into the rhythms of the house with the confidence of someone who assumes permanence. She spoke about plans, about changes, about the future, using words like we that did not include me. I spent more time alone, not because anyone told me to, but because solitude had been made convenient. I walked through the house when no one else was home, touching walls, pausing by doorways, remembering where things used to be. I remembered repainting the bedroom with my husband years ago, the way he had smudged blue paint onto his cheek and laughed when I tried to wipe it away. That room had held grief, too. I had slept there alone after he died, learning the weight of emptiness one night at a time. Losing it felt like losing him again, only quieter. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. She seemed careful, contained, like someone waiting for instructions that never came. I wondered when I had begun asking permission without words. I wondered when love had started to feel like a negotiation I was always losing. Still, I told myself this was normal. I told myself aging comes with adjustments. I told myself I should be grateful my son still wanted me nearby. Gratitude can be a shield if you hold it tightly enough. One afternoon, while folding laundry in my small room, I found an old envelope tucked into the back of a drawer I hadn't opened in years. It was nothing important, just a document I had set aside and forgotten. I held it longer than necessary, feeling the thickness of the paper, the certainty of ink that doesn't fade. I placed it back carefully, aligning it just so, and closed the drawer. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house breathe around me. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed softly. I didn't look up. I had a feeling this silence was only the beginning. After that, time began to stretch in ways I wasn't used to. Days no longer moved forward with purpose. They drifted, looping back on themselves, filled with small repetitions that made it hard to tell one from another. I woke early out of habit, even though no one expected breakfast anymore. I washed my cup as soon as I finished using it, dried it, and put it back in the same place, as if order itself might notice my effort and reward me. The house remained polite and distant. It gave me shelter, but nothing else. My daughter-in-law rarely spoke to me directly. When she did, it was about practical matters, things that needed agreement but not discussion. She asked if I preferred whole milk or low-fat, then bought what she preferred anyway. She reminded me to keep the back room window closed at night because it made the house cold. She spoke gently, reasonably, the way you speak when you believe kindness is measured by tone rather than outcome. I thanked her every time. Gratitude had become a reflex, like blinking. My son moved through the house as if he were visiting, not living. He left early and came home late, often after I had already retreated to my room. When we crossed paths, he smiled with a tightness around the eyes that suggested effort. He asked if I was doing all right. I said yes, because anything else would have required a longer conversation, and he no longer seemed built for those. Sometimes I wondered if he believed his own questions or if they were simply habits carried over from another life. I stopped using the front rooms altogether. The living room felt staged now, arranged for an audience that did not include me. The television volume was set to a level that assumed younger ears. The couch cushions were rotated weekly, plumped and smoothed, but never warm. I sat in my small room instead, reading old magazines, folding and refolding blankets that didn't need it. I learned the sounds of the house in detail. I could tell who was walking by the rhythm of their steps. I could tell their moods by how hard doors were closed. Once, while passing the open doorway of my old bedroom, I caught a glimpse of new curtains hanging where mine had been. They were pale, almost cheerful, letting in more light than before. The bed was larger now, dressed in unfamiliar linens. For a moment, I felt as though I were looking into someone else's house entirely, a place I had wandered into by mistake. I moved on quickly, afraid that if I lingered, I might say something aloud. Some thoughts are safer unspoken. Loneliness has a sound. It's not silence exactly, it's the hum beneath everything, the awareness that your presence or absence makes no difference to the shape of the day. I felt it most at dinner time, when smells filled the kitchen but no one called my name. Sometimes I ate earlier, sometimes later, depending on when the space felt least occupied. I washed my plate immediately and carried it back to my room, careful not to leave evidence of myself behind. It was easier that way, easier to pretend I was just passing through. I told myself this arrangement was temporary, even as days turned into weeks. Temporary is a comforting word. It suggests movement, change, an endpoint you can aim toward. I repeated it often, especially at night. Still, I began to notice how my belongings seemed to shrink. A chair was moved, a shelf emptied, a drawer reassigned. These changes happened without ceremony, each one small enough to dismiss on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I did not want to name. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law mentioned they were thinking about repainting the hallway. She spoke as if asking for my opinion, then continued before I could answer, describing colors she liked and styles she'd seen online. I nodded and listened, imagining the walls stripped of their familiar tones, the last traces of our shared past covered over. I thought about how easily surfaces can be renewed, how permanence is often just a matter of habit. When she finished speaking, she smiled, satisfied, and returned to her phone. I began taking longer walks outside, not because I enjoyed them, but because they gave me somewhere else to exist. I walked the same route each time, past houses that had been renovated, sold, repainted, their lives changing behind closed doors. I wondered how many stories were being quietly rewritten inside those walls. I wondered how many people were nodding along to decisions already made. When I returned home, I paused before opening the door, breathing in the air as if it belonged to me alone for just a moment longer. At night, I lay awake thinking about ownership, about what it really means to belong somewhere. The house was still in my name. The papers were still where they had always been. That knowledge sat inside me like a small, steady weight. I didn't examine it closely. I didn't need to. It was enough to know it existed. I had learned long ago that patience can look like weakness to those who don't understand it. I had also learned that waiting does not mean forgetting. There were moments, brief and sharp, when I felt anger rise. It surprised me with its clarity, then retreated just as quickly, leaving behind a calm that felt deliberate. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't even hoping for change. I was observing. I was learning the new rules of this quiet game, the one where words mattered less than actions and presence mattered least of all. Every day taught me something new, even when nothing appeared to happen. One evening, as I turned off the light in my small room, I heard my name spoken downstairs. It was casual, almost careless, followed by laughter. I stayed where I was, listening, wondering what version of me they were discussing and whether she sounded anything like the woman sitting in the dark, awake, taking careful note of everything. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped onto the kitchen counter as if it were nothing more than a grocery receipt. My daughter-in-law mentioned it in passing while rinsing a cup, her voice light, almost generous. She said they wanted something small, something tasteful. She said family, of course. The word family hovered between us, thin and uncertain. I picked up the envelope after she left the room and turned it over in my hands. My name was written neatly, correctly, as if care itself were proof of inclusion. I carried it to my room and sat on the bed before opening it. The paper inside was thick, expensive. Their names were printed in elegant lettering, centered, balanced, confident. There was a date, a venue I recognized only from photographs, and a dress code that suggested expectations. At the bottom, in smaller print, there was a note about seating arrangements and punctuality. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope with care. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like anticipation, cautious and quiet, but present. In the days that followed, the house seemed to shift again, this time toward preparation. Boxes arrived, fabric samples appeared on the dining table, phone calls filled the air with plans and decisions. My daughter-in-law moved through these tasks with ease, her voice confident, her laughter frequent. I watched from the edges, occasionally asked for an opinion that was never taken. Still, I felt included in a way I hadn't in some time, even if only as a witness. I told myself this was a turning point. I told myself weddings have a way of reminding people who matters. My son spoke to me more during that time. He asked if I had something to wear. He offered to help if I needed anything altered. His concern felt real, if slightly delayed, like a letter that arrives after the moment it was meant for. I thanked him and said I would manage. I had already begun looking through my closet, pulling out dresses I hadn't worn in years, holding them up to the light. I chose one that felt appropriate, understated, familiar. I pressed it carefully, smoothing out every crease. As the day approached, I noticed how often my daughter-in-law referred to me in the third person, even when I was in the room. She spoke about arrangements, about roles, about timing. Once, I heard her mention that it might be simpler if I arrived early and stayed near the back. She said it gently, practically, as if it were a favor. I nodded when she told me, because nodding was still easier than asking why. I reminded myself that this day was not about me. I reminded myself often. The morning of the wedding, I dressed slowly. I pinned my hair the way I always had, careful not to rush. I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual, searching for reassurance and familiar lines. I told myself I looked fine. I told myself this was enough. When we arrived at the venue, everything was already in motion. Flowers lined the entrance. Music drifted through open doors. People moved with purpose, carrying trays, adjusting details. I followed my son inside, holding my small handbag close. They directed me to a seat near the aisle at first, then hesitated. A woman with a clipboard whispered something to another, glanced at me, then led me farther back. She smiled apologetically, said there had been a mix-up. I sat where she indicated, near the end of a row, partially obscured by a pillar. From there, I could see the backs of heads, the edge of the altar, the movement of light. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was still present. As guests filled the seats, I noticed familiar faces, some surprised to see me, others avoiding my eyes. Conversations hushed as the ceremony began. Everyone stood when the music changed. I stood too, though my view didn't improve. When my son appeared, he looked confident, happy, unaware. When my daughter-in-law followed, radiant and assured, the room seemed to lean toward her. Applause filled the space. I clapped softly, my hands barely making sound. During the ceremony, I listened to vows spoken clearly, promises made publicly, words about partnership, about respect, about building a life together. They were beautiful words. They always are. I wondered which parts would be remembered later and which would be forgotten first. When it ended, everyone stood again, turning, smiling, congratulating. I remained seated for a moment longer, waiting for the crowd to thin, unsure where I was meant to go. At the reception, tables were labeled with names and themes. I found mine after a brief search, tucked near the service door. It seated distant relatives and acquaintances, people kind enough but unfamiliar. My name card was printed smaller than the others, or perhaps it only seemed that way. I sat and folded my napkin in my lap, listening to speeches echo across the room. My son spoke, thanked many people. He did not mention me. My daughter-in-law spoke next, her voice steady, gracious. She thanked her parents, her friends, her support system. I clapped when everyone else did. When dinner was served, a server leaned close and asked quietly if I was supposed to be at that table. I said yes. She nodded and moved on, unconvinced. I ate slowly, tasting very little. Laughter rose and fell around me, waves I was not part of. I watched my son across the room, his hand resting easily on his wife's back, his smile unguarded. I felt something tighten inside my chest, not sharply, but firmly, like a door being closed with intention. As the evening wore on, the lights dimmed, music grew louder, and people moved toward the dance floor. I stayed where I was, my coat folded over the back of the chair. No one came to check on me. No one asked if I needed anything. I told myself this was fine. I told myself I was tired anyway. When I finally stood to leave, slipping out quietly through the side entrance, the night air felt cool and unfamiliar. I paused outside, listening to the muffled celebration behind me, and realized I had never felt so visible and so invisible at the same time. I did not tell anyone I had left early. I returned to the house alone, unlocked the door, and stepped inside as quietly as I could, as if the walls themselves might accuse me of something. The lights were off. The rooms were unfamiliar again, temporarily empty, like a stage after the audience is gone. I placed my shoes neatly by the door and sat on the edge of the small bed in the back room without turning on the lamp. I stayed like that for a long time, listening to my own breathing, waiting for whatever feeling was supposed to arrive next. Nothing dramatic came, just a slow heaviness, settling where anticipation had once been. In the days after the wedding, the house filled again, this time with a different kind of certainty. My daughter-in-law returned wearing her new name comfortably, like a garment she had already broken in. She moved through the house with an authority that no longer needed explanation. My son followed her lead without hesitation. Decisions were announced, not discussed. Furniture was moved, schedules were adjusted. I was informed of changes the way one informs a guest of house rules, politely, briefly, without expectation of response. There were photos everywhere now, on the mantel, on the walls, in frames that replaced older ones without ceremony. Their wedding portrait occupied the space where a family picture once hung. I noticed this the first morning I came into the living room and stopped short, uncertain why the room felt different. I stood there staring until my daughter-in-law noticed me. She smiled and said it was only temporary until they decided on something more permanent. I nodded. Temporary had become a word that followed me like a shadow. My son thanked me again for letting them live there. He said it casually, almost cheerfully, as if gratitude were something you could offer retroactively and expect it to count. He spoke about their plans, about saving, about the future. He said the house was a good foundation. He did not say for whom. I listened, hands folded, posture careful. I realized then that he spoke of the house the way one speaks of an inheritance not yet received, with confidence that time itself was on his side. I returned to my routines, smaller now, more contained. I stayed out of shared spaces unless necessary. I ate at odd hours. I learned to move through the house quietly, to leave no trace. My daughter-in-law commented once that I was very easy to live with. She said it like a compliment. I smiled and said nothing. Ease, I had learned, often comes from absence. One afternoon, a friend called to congratulate me. She had seen photos online. She said it must have been such a proud moment. I thanked her and said it was lovely. I did not correct her, explaining would have required words I wasn't ready to use. After the call, I sat for a long time with the phone in my hand, thinking about how appearances travel faster than truth, thinking about how silence can make a convincing story if you let it. I began sorting through old papers during those quieter days, not with any intention, just to keep my hands busy. Receipts, manuals, letters from years ago. I stacked them neatly, then restacked them when the piles didn't feel right. In the back of a drawer, I found documents I recognized immediately, though I hadn't looked at them in years. I didn't open them then. I placed them back where they were, aligned carefully, and closed the drawer. Some things are better acknowledged slowly. The tension in the house was subtle but persistent. It lived in glances exchanged over my head, in conversations that stopped when I entered a room. It lived in the way my daughter-in-law began referring to spaces as ours when speaking to others. I overheard her once on the phone, describing the house as theirs, correcting herself only briefly before continuing. I stood in the hallway and listened, feeling oddly detached, as if she were talking about a place I used to know. One evening, I asked my son if we could talk. I said it gently, without urgency. He looked surprised, then uncomfortable. We sat at the kitchen table, the space between us filled with unspoken things. I told him I felt displaced. I chose my words carefully, calmly. I told him I missed my room. He listened, nodding occasionally, his expression thoughtful but distant. When I finished, he sighed and said this phase was just difficult for everyone. He said I needed to be patient. He said things would settle. I nodded. We cleared the table in silence. After that conversation, something shifted, not outwardly, not in any way others would notice, but I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I stopped waiting for consideration. I began to understand the shape of my position clearly, without emotion attached. Clarity can be strangely comforting. It removes the burden of hope. I no longer wondered if things would return to how they were. I accepted that they would not. Late one night, unable to sleep, I walked through the house barefoot. I paused outside my old bedroom door, listening to voices inside, low and intimate. I did not feel anger. I felt distance. I continued on, through the living room, the kitchen, to the front door. I rested my hand against it briefly, feeling the solidness of the wood, the familiar weight. I thought about thresholds, about how crossing them changes what is possible. When I returned to my room, I closed the door quietly and locked it, lifting the handle slightly so it would catch. I lay down and stared into the dark, knowing that whatever came next would not be announced and that I would have to be ready long before anyone realized there was something to respond to. After that night, I began to live as if I were invisible on purpose. There is a difference between being unseen and choosing not to be seen, and I found some steadiness in that distinction. I stopped offering help. I stopped anticipating needs. I let requests come to me instead of meeting them halfway. When they didn't come, I accepted that too. The house adjusted easily to my quiet withdrawal. It always does when someone reduces themselves carefully. My days settled into a pattern that felt almost deliberate. I woke early, before anyone else, and took my tea in the back room with the door closed. I read slowly, the same page sometimes more than once, not because I was confused, but because I wasn't in a hurry to move forward. I cleaned only what I used. I left shared messes untouched. It wasn't defiance, it was accuracy. I began living only inside the boundaries that were clearly mine. My daughter-in-law seemed pleased by this. She commented once that I was very independent for my age. She said it while scrolling through her phone, not looking up. I thanked her. Independence is often praised when it makes other people comfortable. My son seemed relieved as well. He stopped checking in entirely. He stopped asking questions that might require answers. I watched him relax into a version of himself that did not include responsibility from me, and I wondered when that relief had begun. There were moments when I felt the urge to speak, to point out small injustices, small erasures. I let those moments pass. I had learned that protest without leverage only teaches people how little they need to listen. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed how mail was sorted. I noticed which bills were opened and which were left for me. I noticed how my daughter-in-law spoke to service people when she thought no one was listening, how her politeness thinned when she felt entitled. These observations did not upset me, they clarified things. I spent afternoons organizing my small room with a care that bordered on reverence. I repaired the loose drawer handle. I replaced the flickering bulb with one I found in the garage. I arranged my books by size, then rearranged them by familiarity. I found comfort in order that did not require permission. When I closed the door at night, the room felt like a contained world, one that answered only to me. Occasionally, someone would knock. My daughter-in-law would ask where a document was or whether I had seen a particular receipt. I answered honestly. I did not volunteer more than was asked. Each interaction felt transactional, clean, without confusion. I began to understand that they still needed me, just not in the way I had once imagined. They needed access, not presence, memory, not opinion, ownership without ownership. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I overheard my name spoken again downstairs. This time, I listened more closely. My daughter-in-law was speaking to someone on the phone, describing the house, the layout, the rooms. She referred to my space as the spare room. She laughed and said I didn't mind. I stood very still, holding a towel mid-fold, and waited for the familiar tightening in my chest. It didn't come. Instead, there was a calm recognition, like seeing something written down that you had already understood. That evening, my son mentioned they were thinking about making some long-term changes. He said it casually, testing the air. He talked about renovations, about investments, about stability. He asked if I was comfortable where I was. I said yes. He smiled, relieved again, and continued talking, unaware that comfort and consent are not the same thing. I listened, noting the words he chose, the assumptions he made. I stored them carefully, the way you store fragile items you may need later. I began to revisit old habits I had abandoned. I kept a small notebook again, writing down thoughts that didn't need sharing, dates, conversations, small decisions that affected me without including me. Not because I planned to confront anyone, but because writing made things solid. It prevented memory from being reshaped later. I had learned that people remember differently when it suits them. Paper does not. There were days when sadness washed over me unexpectedly, triggered by something small, a familiar song, the smell of fresh paint, the sound of laughter drifting through a closed door. I let it come and go without ceremony. I did not fight it. I did not dramatize it. Pain, acknowledged quietly, loses some of its power. I reminded myself that endurance is not passive, it is active restraint. At night, I slept better than I had in months. The clarity of my position brought rest. I no longer waited to be included. I no longer anticipated reconciliation. I existed parallel to their lives, close enough to observe, far enough to remain intact. This distance felt intentional, protective. I had stopped trying to belong where belonging required permission. One morning, while retrieving something from a cabinet I rarely used, I found an envelope tucked behind a stack of manuals. It was one I had placed there deliberately years ago, though I hadn't thought about it in some time. I held it, feeling again the certainty of its contents without opening it. I didn't smile. I didn't feel satisfaction. I simply acknowledged it, the way you acknowledge a door you know how to open when the time comes. I put the envelope back carefully and closed the cabinet. Downstairs, I could hear my daughter-in-law talking animatedly about plans, about timelines, about things moving forward. I returned to my room and closed the door gently. I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap, feeling steady, composed, and very awake. Whatever they believed about me, whatever assumptions they had built their confidence on, they were doing so without asking the one question that mattered, and I was no longer inclined to correct them. By then, my presence in the house had become predictable in its absence. They no longer adjusted their voices when I entered a room because I rarely did. They no longer checked whether I was home before making plans because my schedule did not factor into theirs. This invisibility had a strange advantage. People are careless when they think no one is watching. They speak freely. They assume agreement where none has been given. I listened without appearing to listen, absorbed without reacting, and learned more than I ever had when I was trying to be included. My daughter-in-law began talking openly about money, not to me, but around me, the way people talk around furniture. She spoke about budgeting, about how expensive it was to maintain a house like this, about how ownership came with responsibility. She said these things while standing in the kitchen I had remodeled years earlier, leaning against counters I had chosen carefully, as if the words themselves might transfer weight from her shoulders to mine. I rinsed my cup and dried it thoroughly before putting it away. My son grew more confident in these conversations. He used phrases like long-term and investment, like someone rehearsing a role he intended to step into fully. He mentioned property values, neighborhoods improving, timing. He spoke about security as if it were something newly discovered. Once he said it would be good to have everything settled properly, just to avoid complications later. He said it lightly, but I noticed the pause that followed, the waiting. I gave him nothing to hold on to. Silence, when used carefully, can be precise. There were practical changes, too. Bills began arriving in stacks addressed to the household rather than to me. My daughter-in-law offered to organize them, saying it might be easier if everything was in one place. I thanked her and said I preferred to keep my system. She smiled, tight and brief, and said, "Of course." Later, I noticed some envelopes opened anyway, resealed poorly, as if curiosity had gotten ahead of permission. I said nothing. I simply adjusted where I kept certain things. I reduced what I brought into shared spaces. Fewer papers, fewer personal items, fewer traces. My room became increasingly self-contained. I purchased a small kettle and kept it there. I stored my important things in a single drawer that locked easily. I was not hiding, I was consolidating. There is a difference. I told myself this was sensible, given my age, given how easily things can be misplaced. That explanation satisfied anyone who asked, which was no one. My daughter-in-law began to speak to me with a new tone, one that hovered between politeness and instruction. She reminded me of appointments I had not forgotten. She suggested routines I already followed. She framed these comments as concern. I accepted them calmly. Concern is difficult to argue with, especially when it disguises control. I had no interest in confrontation that would only confirm her assumptions about fragility. One evening, I overheard them talking in the living room while I sat quietly in my room with the door ajar. They were discussing paperwork, timelines, the importance of clarity. My name came up briefly, followed by a pause, then a phrase spoken too softly to catch completely. I did not lean closer. I did not strain to hear. What mattered was not the exact words, but the ease with which they spoke about me as a factor rather than a person. That ease told me everything. I spent more time outside after that, not walking aimlessly anymore, but sitting on a bench a few streets away where I could watch people pass. I watched couples argue and reconcile in public, children pulling away from parents' hands, older women carrying their bags with quiet determination. I wondered how many of them were assumed to be finished when they were simply quiet. I wondered how often silence is mistaken for surrender. At home, my daughter-in-law asked one afternoon if I had considered downsizing someday. She said it gently, as if suggesting a hobby. She talked about apartments, about convenience, about freedom from responsibility. She said it might be easier for everyone. I looked at her and saw no malice, only certainty. I told her I had not thought about it. That was true, I had not thought about it in the way she meant. She nodded, satisfied, as if the thought alone were progress. That night, I took out the notebook I had been keeping and wrote down the conversation, word for word as best I could remember. Not because I feared forgetting, but because writing anchored me. It reminded me that my perception was intact, that I was not imagining shifts that were not there. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it back in its drawer, aligned with the others. Order steadies the mind. Sleep came late. I lay listening to the house settle, the familiar creaks and distant sounds. I thought about how long I had lived here, how many versions of myself this place had held. Young wife, grieving widow, careful mother. I thought about how easily people reassign value when they believe time has done their work for them. I felt no bitterness, only a clear understanding that whatever came next would require me to remain exactly as I was now, quiet, observant, unmistakably present even when overlooked. In the morning, my son mentioned he might speak to someone about advice. He said it casually, as if discussing the weather. Advice about planning, about the future. He looked at me briefly when he said it, searching for something I did not offer. I smiled and wished him a good day. He left looking reassured, confident that things were moving in the right direction. I returned to my room and sat on the bed, hands folded, posture calm. I felt no urgency. Whatever steps they believed they were taking, whatever conversations they were having without me, were built on assumptions that had never been tested. Assumptions can be useful. They make people careless, and carelessness, I had learned, creates openings you don't need to force. You only need to wait for them to appear. The letter came addressed to me, my full name written correctly, without abbreviations. I found it in the mailbox one morning before anyone else was awake. The return address was from the bank I had used for decades, the same one my husband and I had opened our first account with when the house was still new to us. I stood on the porch a moment longer than necessary, feeling the weight of the envelope in my hand, then went back inside and closed the door quietly behind me. I did not open it right away. I placed it on the small table in my room and made my tea first. I sat and drank it slowly, letting the steam rise and fade, letting my breathing settle. I had learned not to rush moments that matter. When I finally opened the envelope, the paper inside was formal, precise. It referenced an inquiry, a consultation, and documentation requested. It did not accuse, it did not warn, it simply confirmed what I already knew had been set in motion without my knowledge. Later that day, my son mentioned he had an appointment. He said it casually, almost cheerfully, as if it were nothing more than an errand. He said they wanted to get clarity, just to be safe. My daughter-in-law nodded beside him, her expression composed, confident. I asked where the appointment was. He hesitated, then named the bank. I nodded, sipped my tea, and said I had business there as well. The pause that followed was brief but unmistakable. We drove together. The car was quiet, the kind of quiet filled with unspoken assumptions. My daughter-in-law sat in the front seat, scrolling through her phone. My son drove carefully, both hands on the wheel. I watched familiar streets pass by, places I had known longer than either of them had known each other. When we arrived, the building looked the same as it always had, solid, unhurried. Inside, we were greeted politely and shown to a small conference room. The banker who entered recognized me immediately. He smiled warmly, addressed me by name, and asked how I had been. My son stiffened slightly. My daughter-in-law looked from one face to the other, her smile fixed but uncertain. We sat. Papers were placed on the table, arranged neatly. The banker explained the purpose of the meeting calmly, professionally. He spoke about records, ownership, and authority. My daughter-in-law began to speak, confident at first. She explained what they were hoping to do, how they were planning for the future, how it made sense to simplify things. The banker listened attentively, then turned to me. He asked if that aligned with my intentions. His tone was neutral, respectful. I looked at my son, then back at the banker, and said it did not. The room felt suddenly smaller. My son cleared his throat. He said there must have been a misunderstanding. He said they thought it was already arranged, that we had discussed it. I shook my head gently. I said we had not. I said the house was still entirely in my name as it had always been. I said no changes had been authorized. I said this calmly, without emphasis, without accusation, just fact. The banker nodded and slid a document toward them, one I recognized immediately. It outlined the current status of the property clearly, unmistakably. There were dates, signatures, legal language that did not bend to interpretation. My daughter-in-law read it quickly, then again more slowly. Her confidence drained in stages, like color fading from fabric left too long in the sun. She looked at my son. He looked at the table. The banker explained next steps, procedures, safeguards. He spoke about consent, capacity, and verification. He explained that no transfer, no refinancing, no alteration could occur without my explicit approval. He explained that any attempt otherwise would raise concerns. He was careful with his words, but the meaning was clear. The room was very quiet. My daughter-in-law finally looked at me directly. Her expression was not angry, it was startled. She asked why I hadn't said anything. I told her I had been listening. I told her I assumed if there were questions, I would be asked. My son shifted in his seat, his voice low when he spoke my name. He said they were only trying to help. I said I understood. Understanding does not require agreement. The meeting ended politely. Hands were shaken. Appointments were scheduled that did not include them. When we stood to leave, the banker walked me to the door, asked if I needed anything else. I said no. That was true. Outside, the air felt different, clearer. We walked to the car without speaking. The drive home was slower. My daughter-in-law stared out the window. My son drove with rigid focus. Halfway back, he spoke. He said he wished I had told him sooner. I said I had been waiting to be asked. He said this didn't have to be complicated. I said clarity often feels that way at first. No one spoke after that. At home, my daughter-in-law went straight upstairs. My son lingered in the kitchen, his shoulders tense. He asked what I planned to do now. The question hung between us, heavy with assumption. I told him I planned to continue living as I had been. I told him nothing had changed, except that certain things were now understood. He nodded slowly, as if recalibrating something he had been sure of only hours earlier. That evening, the house felt unsettled. Doors closed more carefully, voices were lower. I stayed in my room, reading, my door locked as always. I felt no triumph, only relief. Quiet and steady. The truth had been spoken plainly. No one had raised their voice. No one had been accused. Yet something fundamental had shifted, and everyone could feel it. As I turned off the light, I thought about how easily certainty collapses when it is built without permission. I thought about how long they had mistaken my silence for consent. Down the hall, I heard a door close sharply, then footsteps pacing. I lay still, listening, knowing the calm of this moment would not last, and that whatever came next would be shaped not by anger, but by the simple fact that I had never stopped owning what was mine. The morning after the bank meeting, the house woke differently. There was no raised voice, no confrontation waiting in the kitchen, no dramatic silence meant to punish. Instead, there was a carefulness that felt rehearsed. Cupboards were opened more quietly, footsteps paused before turning corners. It was the sound people make when they are recalculating, when certainty has been replaced by caution, and no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. My daughter-in-law did not speak to me at breakfast. She moved around the kitchen efficiently, deliberately, as if the room itself needed to be reminded who was in control of it. She wiped the counter twice where I had already cleaned. She aligned the chairs. She did not look at me once. I ate slowly, finished my tea, rinsed my cup, and returned to my room without comment. There was no satisfaction in her avoidance, only confirmation. My son tried later that day. He knocked on my door, waited, then knocked again, softer. When I opened it, he smiled in a way that was meant to reassure both of us. He said things felt tense. He said everyone was adjusting. He said maybe we could talk about expectations. I listened, leaning against the door frame, feeling the solidness of the wood behind me. When he finished, I told him I agreed that clarity was important. I told him I had always been clear. He nodded slowly, as if hearing something familiar spoken in a new language. After that, they began to separate themselves from me in small, deliberate ways. Meals were eaten later, plans were made elsewhere, conversations moved upstairs. I was no longer asked opinions at all, not even performatively. This exclusion was cleaner, more honest. It hurt less than the earlier version that pretended inclusion while practicing erasure. Distance, when acknowledged, can be a form of respect. I noticed my daughter-in-law began speaking about moving with more urgency. She mentioned listings she had seen, neighborhoods they liked, timelines that made sense. She spoke about these things openly now, not around me, but past me, as if my presence no longer required careful navigation. I understood then that the house had changed shape for her. It was no longer something she could grow into. It had become an obstacle. My son struggled more visibly. He lingered in shared spaces as if unsure where he belonged. He asked questions that went nowhere. He apologized for things without naming them. I did not reassure him. I did not correct him. I let him feel the discomfort of imbalance because it was not something I could fix without undoing myself. Love does not require self-erasure, no matter how often people confuse the two. One afternoon, I overheard an argument upstairs, not loud, but sharp enough to carry. My name was not mentioned, but I recognized the shape of the conversation. It was about expectations unmet, about assumptions failing under pressure. I sat in my room and read, letting the words blur on the page, aware of the tension but not absorbing it. Their conflict was not mine to manage. That distinction felt new and strangely liberating. The house itself seemed to respond. Doors were closed more often, music played louder behind walls, the living room went unused. I found myself with more space simply because no one else wanted to occupy it anymore. I sat in my old chair one evening, the one that had been turned away from the window, and moved it back. No one commented, no one objected. Reclaiming does not always require permission. Sometimes it only requires silence and time. My daughter-in-law stopped thanking me. She stopped commenting on my routines. She stopped pretending to manage me. In its place was a formality that bordered on indifference. I preferred it. There's honesty in withdrawal. There is clarity when people stop performing kindness they do not feel. We passed each other in hallways like strangers who had shared an address for too long. One night, my son sat with me briefly after dinner. He looked tired, older somehow. He asked if I was angry. I considered the question carefully. I told him I was not angry. I told him I was resolved. He frowned as if that answer unsettled him more than anger would have. He said he didn't want things to be this way. I told him neither did I once. He did not ask what had changed. They began packing gradually, not all at once. A box here, a cleared shelf there. It was done quietly, without announcement, as if acknowledging the departure might give it more weight than they were ready to carry. I watched these preparations without comment. I did not help. I did not interfere. I allowed them the dignity of their decision, just as I had allowed myself the dignity of mine. The night before they told me officially, I slept deeply. There were no dreams I could remember, only rest. When I woke, the house felt lighter, not because someone was leaving, but because something heavy had already been lifted. At breakfast, my daughter-in-law said they had found a place. She said it was better for everyone. I agreed. The truth does not always require elaboration. After they left the room, I sat alone at the table and looked around. The walls were still the same. The light fell in the same places. The house had not rejected me. It had simply endured. I realized then that separation does not always come with drama. Sometimes it arrives quietly, after understanding has already done its work. That evening, as boxes were carried downstairs and loaded into the car, I stayed in my room with the door open. I listened to the sounds of departure, the scraping, the careful coordination, the finality hidden beneath politeness. When the door finally closed behind them, the silence that followed was not empty. It was expectant. I stood slowly, walked into the hallway, and felt the house settle around me, aware that this ending was not the conclusion, but the threshold to something that had been waiting longer than any of us had known. The first morning after they were gone, I woke without confusion. There was no moment of forgetting, no instinct to listen for other footsteps. The house was quiet in a way that felt complete rather than vacant. I lay still for a while, letting the stillness settle into me, noticing how my body responded to it. My breathing was even, my thoughts were unhurried. It occurred to me that peace is not something that arrives all at once. It reveals itself gradually through the absence of strain. I made my tea and carried it into the living room, sitting in the chair by the window that had once been turned away. Sunlight fell across the floor exactly as it always had. Nothing dramatic had changed, and yet everything felt restored to its proper scale. I was no longer navigating around other people's certainty. I was no longer measuring myself against expectations that had never included me. The space belonged to itself again, and so did I. In the days that followed, I moved through the house without hesitation. I reopened drawers. I returned objects to places that made sense to me. I rehung an old photograph I had taken down years earlier, not out of nostalgia, but because it fit there. I slept in my bedroom again, the one that had held so much of my life, and found that it welcomed me back without question. Familiarity is not something that needs to be earned. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel wronged. What I felt was alignment. Things were once again where they belonged. That included me. I spent long afternoons reading, sometimes forgetting what time it was. I cooked meals I enjoyed, not worrying whether they suited anyone else's preferences. I ate at the table, or by the window, or standing in the kitchen, depending on the day. Choice, I realized, is a quiet luxury. My son called once, a week after they moved. He asked how I was settling in. I told him I was well. He sounded relieved, though I wasn't sure why. He spoke about their new place, the adjustments they were making. I listened without judgment. When the conversation ended, there was no heaviness, no ache, just distance, clean and appropriate. Love, I have learned, does not always require closeness to remain intact. I returned to routines I had abandoned years earlier. I tended the small garden behind the house, trimming branches, pulling weeds slowly, carefully. Growth is not rushed when it is meant to last. I repaired things that had been left unattended, small tasks that had once seemed insignificant. Each repair felt like a quiet affirmation that I was still capable, still responsible, still here. Occasionally, I thought about the months that had passed, about the woman I had been while shrinking myself to fit into someone else's confidence. I did not judge her harshly. She had been doing what she thought love required. But I also understood now that love does not ask for disappearance. It does not ask you to vacate yourself to make room for others. What had felt like patience had been something else entirely. I was grateful I had learned the difference before it cost me more. There were moments when neighbors asked questions, curious about the change. I answered simply. People often expect explanations to carry emotion. I did not provide that. Facts were enough. The house was mine. I lived here alone now. I was content. Contentment, I discovered, unsettles people more than anger ever could. I reviewed my documents one afternoon, not because I felt threatened, but because clarity is comforting. Everything was in order. Everything had always been in order. I closed the folder and placed it back where it belonged, knowing I would likely not need to look at it again for a long time. Security does not come from control over others. It comes from understanding your own position clearly. In the evenings, I sat by the window and watched the street change colors as the light faded. Cars passed, people returned home, lives continued in parallel. I felt connected to them without needing to participate. Solitude, when chosen, is not loneliness, it is space. It is permission to exist without explanation. I did not feel the need to forgive anyone because I did not feel the weight of resentment. What happened had happened. It had revealed what needed revealing. That was enough. I had not won anything. I had simply stopped losing myself. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about my husband, about the life we had built in this house, the certainty we had shared without needing to name it. I imagined him sitting across from me, listening as he always had. I think he would have understood. He had always known that strength does not announce itself. It endures, it observes, it waits until action is no longer avoidable. Now, when I walk through the house, my footsteps sound sure. The walls do not feel watchful. The air does not feel conditional. I am not bracing for change. I am not managing anyone's comfort at my own expense. I have what I need. I know where I stand. The bedroom door closes behind me at night with a familiar sound. The lock catches easily. I sleep deeply. In the morning, I wake without needing to prepare myself for anyone else's expectations. The house and I understand each other again. And that, I have learned, is not something you give away lightly.